Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good day, and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Tabak, and today I will moderate a discussion about populism. We're going to think about whether populism is a good thing or a bad thing. I have the help of two people from our community today. Here I have Lyle Muller and Taylor Houston, and I'll ask you each to introduce yourself and your connection to this topic. So Taylor is a new professor at Mount Mercy University. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background?
Sure. So I'm Dr. Taylor Houston. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Mount Mercy University, and I'm really interested in issues of inequality and how that leads to social movements, revolutions, people getting out into the streets calling for social and political change. And so that's what drew me to this topic.
And you told me that you're new to our community, that you've come here from Georgia most recently?
Yes,
okay.
So I've been in Iowa for a little over a year now, but I'm originally from the South, so got my PhD in Georgia, and before that I was raised in Texas, in Houston, and in San Marcos and Austin.
And Lyle, you have a background in journalism, and you're with Iowa Watch. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and what brings you to this topic?
Iowa Watch is part of the Iowa Center for Public Affairs Journalism, and we exist to do investigative reporting and train college students. And among the things that we try to do is keep on track of media trends and news trends, the way to deliver news. And so that's what attracts me to this, because there's an awful lot being said right now about populism. As far as my background, I've been a journalist for 45 years in Iowa, almost all of those except for 2 in Minnesota when I worked up there. I worked at the Cedar Rapids Gazette for 25 years in various roles, starting with bureau chief in Iowa City, and I was a reporter, which I really enjoyed. I was a senior editor, and eventually for 3 years before I left to go to Iowa Watch, the editor of the Gazette.
Okay. So the word populism is in the news a lot in the last year, and I've seen commentators apply it to political developments in the United States and in other countries. I'm hoping that in our conversation we might see something about the use of this term throughout history, and how our experience in the United States is connecting with experiences overseas now. Now I'll start here. I have little knowledge of journalism, but when I was an undergraduate student in Boston in 1980, I followed John Anderson for a day around New Hampshire during the New Hampshire primary season. John Anderson was a congressman from Illinois who ran independently against Ronald Reagan and Jimmy Carter that year. Is that populism? Do you remember that one?
I do remember John Anderson, and he certainly was striking a nerve. And usually what you'll see is these third-party candidates being populist. And what that means is they're appealing to people who say, we want something different and we want what we know is right. We don't necessarily have the details of that, but we want something that's right. And so John Anderson, when he came on the scene, he actually had a program, and that appealed to a lot of people. And it was a more liberal approach to Republican Party politics than Ronald Reagan was giving, and it also was not mired in some of the problems that Jimmy Carter had when he got into all of the details of what really were bad things for his presidency, such as a crappy economy, problem with Iran, and all of those types of things. So yeah, I remember that. I think the thing about populism that makes it so interesting now is that the populist won. They don't usually win in these presidential elections unless you go back to someone like Andrew Jackson, who certainly was a populist and espoused this notion of the people are right and the government's wrong. Ronald Reagan, you could say he was a populist to some degree, but he also came with a lot of practical legislation and a program in place with plans on how you would do the things that he was talking about.
So sometimes the word populist is claimed by the candidates. The candidates boast that they're populists, or we've had parties that call themselves the Populist Party, and sometimes the word is used pejoratively. It's the principal political parties look at their challengers and use the word populist in a bad way against them. Is populist good word, bad word?
Well, I think that when thinking about it, one, we have to define what we consider populism. The definitions have ranged throughout time. There's no kind of concrete notion of what populism is. But one thing that populists all do is they divide, right? They're not the individuals who are looking to bring people together saying, you know, we represent one type of people, and typically we are the people representing the working man, right? And typically who they are representing them against is the elite, right? So it depends on your perspective. Do you see elite power as a problem? Do you see a hierarchy as problematic? If so, then then you might see populism as quite good, right? It's speaking to a certain set of folks who typically are considered not having a lot of power in society. On the other hand, when it comes to how people go about gaining support from the people, that's where you start to see problems, where a lot of people, criticize populism because they might point to inequality, whether it's class inequality or political inequality, but their solutions either are very simplistic and we don't know how well it's actually going to address the issue, or they find scapegoats. And in our American tradition, most populists, while class has been at the forefront of the topic, race has always been in the background. So with the People's Party in the 1800s, they blamed their issues on the Chinese that were coming over, right? When you have George Wallace in the 60s, right, he was blaming it on the African Americans. When you have, say, for example, Buchanan in the 80s, it was illegal immigrants. And today, when people refer to Trump as a populist, they can talk about how many Muslim Americans, as well as illegal immigrants, as well as immigrants just in general, have also been scapegoated as the issues behind this. And so it depends on your perspective, I think. If you see yourself as part of that populist party, then you think it's great because your voice is finally being heard. But for those who don't fall in, who don't fit that category, it can be quite problematic.
Part of the problem in defining populism, and there isn't that definition you can stick to, but part of the problem, I think, in defining populism is that inherent in that definition is the notion that the people are right. And if you think about that, that means I'm right, you're right, but we all might disagree on what it is that we think we're right about. And so populism, as far as a political tool, becomes difficult to grasp because you have to find enough people who think that they are right and think the same thing, and then be able to exploit that for your position of power in order to win. And that's been a very difficult haul.
So let's try to name some populists and maybe some of the populist movements in this country. You had some names.
Well, George
before,
Wallace
right.
certainly looms strong there, and his was about racial inequality. Okay. And he appealed to people who said we still have to have separate types of lifestyles for people who are black and white in the United States. You have William Jennings Bryan going back to the turn of the last century, not this past turn, but back in the late 1800s to the 1900s, when he was talking about the idea that we have to have an economy based on the real value of silver. Big Todd issue there that a lot of us have difficulty wrapping our head around right now. And then Andrew Jackson, who was someone who just thought government was wrong and that they were a bunch of elites and we had to have people get in there and do certain things, including making sure that we kept the Native Americans that he was fighting against as an Indian fighter at bay, and so that the United States could expand, and by the way, also help people who liked Andrew Jackson.
Okay. Are there some social divisions that have produced these populist movements? We've mentioned immigration right now. Mm-hmm. Are there others, maybe going back to the 19th century, farmers versus city dwellers? What would be, I'm looking for you for some help there.
Yeah, so I think two of the most common social divisions that we've seen with populism is one when it comes to class, right? So thinking about the working people versus the elites, right? And you see this a lot when talking about who is in charge, right? When typically elites were referred to as those who were in political power, but who have also been associated with monopolies, right? So you can think of the Gilded Age in the early 1900s, where you had steel and other major corporations, U.S. Steel and others, who were dominating the land, and there was this notion that no one could get ahead because there was all the power was being concentrated at the top. And so there's always this discussion of class there, I think, that has divided groups. But what's really interesting is that always behind that has always been a notion of race, and that's because race has been essential to our understanding of America since its birth. And in so many ways, when we talk about class politics in society, it's typically talking about white class politics, right? So typically racial groups, whether it was Native Americans, whether it was the Chinese immigrants, whether it was Japanese immigrants, whether it was African Americans, they were never included into that working class group that was part of the people. It was always the white working class who were being subordinated by the elites. And so that's always been the other underwriting issue that typically gets ignored. I mean, even you think about today, Bernie Sanders has been identified as a populist, and right. Bernie Sanders very much talked about economic inequality. That was what he championed. But when it came to racial issues, one of his critiques was that he really could not talk in depth about it. It took him a while to kind of come around to start mentioning issues of racial inequality in the country. So,
you know, mentioning Bernie Sanders is really interesting. I was having a conversation this past week with someone about populism, and that person mentioned the notion of conservatives. That conservatives are populists, and I had to point out to this person that no, that's not necessarily true. A populist doesn't mean you're conservative or liberal. It means that you think you're right, and so Bernie Sanders is a perfect example. If you look at the type of strength that he had going on in the 2016 primary election against Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. By the way, he was not a registered Democrat until he ran for president. But yet he was making waves, much like Donald Trump did on the Republican side. There's certainly, if we can pull anything out of this election that we've just been through, is that there are an awful lot of people on both sides of the political spectrum who are tired of what is going on as business as usual. And so what do you do there? You throw the rascals out.
Yeah, I think the phrase "it's rigged" was popular with both Bernie Sanders.
Yeah,
and
still
Donald Trump.
still resonates.
Yeah.
It still resonates.
And I know that Gallup just came out with they've been tracking a set of questions for decades now on people's perceptions of what are the top 10 and most important issues to them. And something that's been going on since the early aughts is this notion that one of the number one things that people say is their lack of trust in government. And I mean, you can see that in the fact that Congress has, I can't remember when they haven't broken 20% in the past almost more than a decade. And so when you have that, when you have a situation where there is such a fundamental lack in trust among government, whether it's a Republican government or a Democratic government, it does create opportunities for populists to come in, for populist movements to start and to have some impact on society.
So we've mentioned William Jennings Bryan, goes back more than 100 years. George Wallace goes back 50 years. We're calling Donald Trump maybe a populist, maybe Bernie Sanders. Others we might include Ralph Nader,
Sure.
a dozen years ago.
Ross
And,
Perot.
Ross
Ross
Perot.
Perot.
I mean, I think I was maybe starting to be a teenager then. I was born in '83, so maybe not even 10 yet, but I do remember him.
You don't want to give that away.
Yeah. But he was one of the first kind of political figures that I can still recognize. I remember from my youth, other than Bush Sr. and Clinton. But I really didn't have a good understanding of what he was for until later on when I went to college and I kind of started learning more about our current political history. But he kind of fell, you probably could talk more about this, more to kind of center left of his politics, but he was very much challenging Clinton's notions of deregulation and NAFTA and trade policies, similar to kind of what both Bernie and Trump were doing as well.
And as I look at some of these figures in history, I look at someone like Ronald Reagan, who I mentioned earlier, who some might say was a populist, but I wouldn't give him that label. Others might, and I wouldn't have much of an argument with that. But he came with a program, a political program, and some political ideas and a notion of what the country should be. It was, and he certainly thought government couldn't solve problems, but he found a way to make government solve the problems he saw there. Franklin Roosevelt, the same thing. He saw problems there. Teddy Roosevelt, and you go back through the history of some of these people who tried to solve problems through political means, and that's why I differentiate them from someone like Donald Trump at this moment. We'll see. Things might change there. We might find out that there is a specific agenda and a vision that he has for the country that that a lot of people aren't realizing, other than his followers.
Taylor shared with me an article before we came together here from the Atlantic Monthly that suggested that populism is what the author called a thin ideology versus a thick ideology. Right. So other ideologies, libertarianism or socialism, they have a level of detail and coherence that makes them thick. And the argument of the authors that you shared with me was that populism is kind of emotional, and it's not very well thought through. We know what we're against, but we're not quite sure what we're in favor of.
Yeah, and if it's a recent one, I've read the same one. The idea is that the depth of your feeling as a populist is you know you're right, but you don't know anything else, such as how to solve the problem. Right. And I think about this, as humans, it's easy to pick on people like that, but think about it. We as humans are that way all of the time. Would you rather be told that when you flip on a switch, electrons go floating from one part of the country through a transmitter across radio waves, and then they oscillate into a receiver that then translate that through circuits so that you can see an image with pixels? Or would you rather be told, I'll turn the TV on and I see a picture? And we always opt for the latter, and I think that's the way we are as people by nature. The kind of folks who really can get into a problem and solve them for a huge society, such as a country like the United States, that's a different kind of beast.
So we also hear the claim that the populist candidate is not a professional politician, and we're going to have somebody with a different background, and that's what's needed. So Ross Perot came from the world of business. Donald Trump is unique in American history, having no previous public office, no military service. He just comes directly to the highest office in the land. Can we comment on this idea that maybe what we need is somebody who has these practical skills and isn't part of the system, is coming from the outside, and is uniquely qualified then to fix our problems?
Well, that's been going on with a lot of industries. Where you want to bring someone in from the outside who isn't ingrained into the same old, whether it be in healthcare, the industry I've been involved in, newspapers, television stations, things like that. And so there is a lot of interest in bringing someone in. The University of Iowa has a president whose background is business, because you wanted to bring someone in to shake things up. And sometimes that stuff can work and sometimes it can't. I think it just depends on the situation.
Okay. Yeah, I think the track record is, is some are successful and some aren't. The one thing that I kind of disagree with is, although Donald Trump doesn't have formal experience in say politics, he's been around politicians most of his career. I mean, you have video footage of him from the 80s and 90s actively going to Congress and lobbying for many of the policies that he's now saying he's against. So there's, in that sense, he's been a part of the system. He's been part of the elite group of people that make up our society for decades now. And even Bernie Sanders, people talk about Bernie Sanders being an outsider, but the man's been in politics for decades now. I mean, he is very much part of the establishment, even if his ideology has not been fallen succinctly with, say, the Democratic ideology or the Republican conservatism. He very much identifies as a democratic socialist. but he's very much part of that same system in many ways.
And Donald Trump knows how to promote and how to deal with an audience and how to attract an audience with a message that will make an emotional appeal. And that is a lot of what goes into these presidential campaigns and in being a leader.
Some years ago, I read a biography of Warren Buffett. And Warren Buffett, as you know, was close friends with Katharine Graham, who ran the Washington Post. And at one point, he persuaded her to come out with him to his home in Nebraska. And on the airplane, he passed her a napkin and a pen, and he said, "Now show me where Nebraska is." And the publisher of the Washington Post couldn't put Nebraska on the map. And so this was presented in the book as a story. Well, here we have the elites who are shaping popular opinion, and they don't know and maybe don't care about the people in the middle. Now, in the last couple of elections, several candidates, or each of these principal candidates, has made some remark that suggested they were either ignorant or contemptuous of the American people. So Mitt Romney made his 7% remark, right? 47% are just taking from government, we're never going to get their votes, and so on. Hillary Clinton made her deplorables remark. Barack Obama made his remark about bitter clingers, and so on. Do you see that, a sense among Americans that the people at the top don't know them, don't care about them? Is that part of what's happening here? Or am I seeing something you're not seeing here?
Well, I think a lot of people feel that the leadership in Washington doesn't understand them. And that's why you had this revolution that we had this past year. This was people saying, listen, we're sick and tired of it. And the interesting thing about the throw the rascals out idea is we're always throwing the other rascals out, not ours, because our rascals understand us. And it makes sense, right? Chuck Grassley visits counties and he talks with people and he has a long relationship with folks. So we're not going to throw that rascal out, even though we want to clean up Congress. But we can throw out the president.
Yeah, and I would just say that what I always find interesting is for whoever we send in, especially those who say that they are going to come to bring change to the culture, that when they get there, in many cases, because the culture is so dominant within that system, that they become a part of it as well. And the other thing that always stands out to me with folks who say, you know, I'm going to bring change, is that in many cases, they say one thing but do another. And this is something that we all do, right? And many, you know, from everything from I'm going to be on a diet, but then you eat that pizza the next day, right? But to an extent, what we see is that a lot of folks come in and then say, you know, we're going to get rid of lobbyists, but then put lobbyists on to our cabinet, or you know, we're gonna. I work for, you know, the working class people, but then all your cabinet people are multi-billionaires, and so there is this sense that we're going to do one thing, but we do another, and we, you know, we continue to see this with the Trump presidency and who he's selected for his cabinet. These aren't outsiders; these are people who have been in the elite for their life.
This is new, Taylor.
Yeah,
If we look back to the previous administration,
oh, absolutely,
the one before that, and the one before that.
Absolutely. And I mean, so Obama said he was there for change, right? And he did make certain changes, but at the same time, right, he, you know, he fell into the same thing as well. And it shows how strong our political institutions are in maintaining the social norms of that institution.
So from my own point of view as a voter, I'm interested not just what the public policy that we select in the end is, but the way we get to it, by the sort of procedure. And as I read the news, I think in Europe, for example, people in Britain were frustrated because the decisions were being made far away by people that they weren't directly voting for. They felt too much of their life. It was too indirect, too distant. And even if the policies were agreeable in the end, they didn't feel like they were in control of their destiny. And I think in Germany and Sweden, some of the stories we hear is people are upset because they feel the government hasn't told them the truth about the crime that has occurred in the immigrant communities. In Cologne, Germany, on New Year's and so on, the government allegedly withheld information about how many assaults occurred. So it's this sense of a distant government, a government we no longer control, as much as the final result of what the public policy would
well,
be.
and people have an emotional attachment to that too, and that's what all of this is about, is this emotional attachment. Here's an example that BuzzFeed, by the way, the band from the White House, BuzzFeed, has come up with recently. They did a look into some media organizations who seem to be doing the same kind of stories, but with different slants. So for example, the Liberal Society, liberal types of stuff, and then there was the Conservative 101. They seem to have the same stories, but different words would be inserted to give red meat to either liberals or to conservatives. What BuzzFeed found out is that both websites are run by the same organization in Miami called American News LLC, which, by the way, there's a conservative American News website that coincides with another American News run website, Democratic Review. So why are they doing this? It's because people are latching on to something that gets to their emotion, and so you actually have real fake news sites that are out there just playing to people's emotions so that they can get income for it and get clicks on their website. So it's all about emotion, about why some of these things are happening.
And that is why I think one of the biggest criticisms of populism is that what are the unintended or intended negative outcomes that can occur? And when you base things off emotion and not based on, in some cases, factual reality, right? That it leads to maybe just a minuscule, but still it leads to negative outcomes. So for example, what happened recently in Missouri, where a man went and shot up two Indian Americans in a restaurant. He thought they were Middle Eastern, but they were Indian American, and he said, "Get out of my country." And so you see these incidences, hate crimes and other things popping up because a lot of it's based on these emotions of, who's here for me and supporting my rights, and who is here that might be taking away my privileges and my benefits.
So we have just a few minutes more. I wonder if you think that what we've seen this year in the United States, what we're seeing overseas, is a part of a trend, that there's going to be a realignment of parties, that this is something that's going to continue, or did we see in November just an unusual set of circumstances that came together, and when we meet again in 4 years, we're going to be back to the usual sort of partisan politics in the United States?
I don't know how to predict that because it's so uncertain. I know that we've had these types of stretches in American history before, and we seem to emerge, in this country at least, with this constitutional democracy that we've always had. So it'll be interesting to play out. I worked with a college student a couple weeks ago who heard the inaugural address, and she said, "I know I'm sitting in the middle of history and that we'll be talking about this long after I'm gone. I can hardly wait to find out what history says about what I'm experiencing."
Really? I'm not sure I understand that. How do you understand that, Taylor? Do I have to wait for somebody else to tell me what I've seen with my own eyes?
I don't know. What I will say is, I think one of the things that a populist movement can do is it can shake things up some. And so I do think there is going to be some changes, not only within the Democratic Party. We saw some challenges for the head of the Democratic seat. Chairship.
Right.
Yeah, and you're the Republicans are trying to do a good job of saying that they're together, but there's lots of talk about divisions even within the Republicans, and so I do think that we might see some shakeups within the political parties. But at the same time, honestly, I don't know what to predict. I'm hoping for the best, but I'm much more the glass half empty kind of perspective right now. So on things, we'll see if economic inequality declines or not. But I'm not so hopeful.
Okay.
You know what Stephen Wright says about a glass half empty? He says, "Then I'm going to drink it."
Okay. I think we've reached the end. Thank you for joining us in this discussion of populism, and good luck as you watch the news and we see what history tells us. Thanks.